I woke up suddenly and just had a bad feeling from it. I tried to shake it off and just laid there for a moment. Welcome to Daily Dose Reddit. What are some of the most eerie and unexplained mysteries that you have experienced in your life? I'm not the kind of person to have a great many friends, but those friends I do keep are scared to see me. So one evening I was getting out of a Rotterdam subway, black, to go to my apartment near there, when I see an old friend, one I haven't seen in the flesh in a few years, heading into the subway. I call out his name, he turns, waves and makes this, "Call me," gesture. Then the doors close and the subway rides off. 30 seconds later, my phone rings. It was my friend, who told me he'd just seen me get in the normal train he'd used to get home from the bar. Apparently, I had grinned, waved, gestured, "Call me." The door shut and the train drove off. I lived in Rotterdam. He lived in Enschede. That's just over 200 kilometers apart. Or about 125 miles. My mom had me picking potatoes one day. Hugely arduous task. Filled one basket, went to fill the other and found it filled. It was just me, my sister was feeding animals and my mom and dad were at work. Simple and unexplained. Not the first unexplained thing that happened in that house. But it was memorable for me. When I was about 10 to 12, a neighborhood buddy and I were camping in the woods. In reality, we were a couple acres behind his house in some forest that backed up to a state park, but that was about as close to camping as I was comfortable with. We had one of his family dogs with us, a beautiful and very protective mutt named Abby. She wasn't the type to startle easy. In the middle of the night we started hearing movement in the forest and Abby started growling and sniffing the air, probably a deer we assumed, until we unzipped one of the windows of the tent a bit to look outside and clearly saw a human figure in the moonlight. It seemed to be standing by a tree just watching us. We kinda spooked ourselves and decided to quietly get our shoes on and bolt back to his place and abandon the camp for the night. As soon as we opened the tent, Abby bolted at the figure, who ran off into the night. She eventually made it back by morning. Still to this day I have no idea what went down here. About a year ago now I was sitting at home watching a movie and noticed out onto the backyard patio a man standing there looking straight up in the air. As high as his head would go, almost looking backward. Scared the living shit out of me. Person was as still as a board. He was dressed in very nice clothes though, a royal blue suit with brown shoes, which didn't really fit the scene. I grabbed my cell phone and watched him for a minute to see what he was doing before I'd call the police. Out of nowhere he shook his head, almost out of a trance, and looked around to see where he was. He took his cell phone out and started making a call. At that point I opened the sliding door, with the screen still being shut, and asked if he was okay. He sounded very frantic and said he doesn't know how he got there. I told him where he was and apparently he lived a few streets over. He walked out the side gate after apologizing profusely. I've seen him a few times in passing and he's seemed extremely normal, drives a Porsche Cayenne. No idea WTF that was about. I remember one thing that genuinely freaked me out when I was 12. I had awoken and gone to the kitchen to fix myself some breakfast. When I got there, I heard my dad's snoring coming from the couch in the living room. I thought it was strange for him to be sleeping since it was 10 a.m. and he typically woke up early. But maybe he is taking a nap. As I'm walking towards there, the snoring keeps on getting louder and louder to the point it sounds exaggerated. Just as I pop my head over the couch to say hi, the sound just stops. Nobody is on the couch. I call out to my family and nobody answers. They had gone out to get lunch. I still can't explain it to this day. Used to work in a crisis shelter when I was in my early 20s. We had a small walk-in room with a solid lock on it to store anything that could be misused by the residents, such as medications, cleaning chemicals, kitchen knives, etc. One night the residents had settled in to watch television while I completed some paperwork, and the door to the medication storage room swung open by itself. I thought perhaps it had not caught properly last time I closed it, so I just pulled it shut and thought nothing more of it for the next few minutes. Then it swung open again. I pulled the door shut and this time jiggled the handle several times to make sure it had caught, and got one of the residents to also test it. It was definitely locked solid. A few minutes later, it swung open again. Wanted to nope out of there but was stuck on a 12-hour sleepover shift. After that it never happened again, but the residents spun a huge story about the ghost of someone who OD'd in the medication room, which became part of the shelter folklore. I was napping shortly after my son was born and I dreamt that my husband came in and told me my dad had passed away. I woke up suddenly and just had a bad feeling from it. I tried to shake it off and just laid there for a moment. A few minutes later my husband did come in the room and told me my father had a heart attack and died at work. Worst feeling in the world. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. I've owned the same house for over 23 years. It began almost immediately. My spoons have been disappearing at an alarming rate. At first, I put it off to the kids. But it didn't stop even after they had moved out. I lived alone for many years and they would still vanish. I checked garbage. I've searched corners and every place where they could conceivably be and not be. I once bought 120 metal teaspoons and they were all gone within a year and a half. More than 10 per month. Oddly, the plastic spoons still disappear, but much more slowly. I will count and keep track of them, and that slows it down, but they somehow keep vanishing. My granddaughters now live with me, but it doesn't seem to be a factor. It's worst in the fall for some reason. I estimate I've lost more than 1,000 spoons somewhere in this house and I can't find them. No, I'm not senile or crazy. Others have noticed the spoon thing here. I can't explain it and have stopped trying. I don't care if anyone believes this shit or not, but you asked and I was in the mood to type it out. I just counted. I'm down to 7 spoons, 3 teaspoons and 4 tablespoons. 3 teaspoons missing since I last checked sometime last month. For decades I have had disturbing dreams from the viewpoint of the backyard of my grandparents' house. Later in life, after they had passed on, my dad bought the place. I never mentioned the bad dreams because it seemed silly, but it was weird to me that this went on for years. 2 weeks ago, my dad went out to that spot in the backyard and killed himself. My father's 2 sisters each lost their husbands within a year of each other. Their husbands had been friends, so they ended up buying cemetery plots next to each other. So at the second funeral, we're lowering Uncle B into his grave. Suddenly, I hear a sizzle. I look up, and instead of a graveyard I'm in a backyard, and Uncle B is grilling. Uncle A, who's been dead a year, says to me, "Do you want some lamb?" Before I can answer, I blink again and I'm back in the graveyard. I tell people that's my seeing a ghost story, but I've considered that it was maybe a vision of the other side. In my sophomore algebra class, a kid named Brian was drawing with his friends on the whiteboard. We were not friends and we barely talked. He was drawing a dragon and I was on the other side of the room halfway listening. He said, "Instead of fire, I'm going to make him breathe," and in my head I thought, it would be cool if he breathed cupcakes, and deadass, Brian looked at me and said, "Cupcakes." And we just looked at each other. And he knew. And I knew. It was no coincidence. There's this pedestrian crossing near my place that I always cross, and for some reason for the past couple of weeks, I'd feel really uneasy whenever I walked across. Then just last Sunday I got hit by a car that failed to stop while I was crossing it. I was 8 years old. I was awakened in the middle of the night needing to go to the bathroom. On my way down the hallway, lights off, I saw faintly the vacuum cleaner lying on the floor, so I stepped over it and went into the bathroom. I turned on the light and shut the door. When I finished and opened the bathroom door, the light shined down the hallway, but there was no vacuum cleaner there. When I was 6, my grandparents took me to this Christian youth revival type event. There were skits about resisting the devil, sing-alongs for Jesus, gymnastic exhibitions for Jesus, guys in karate gear breaking boards for Jesus, things like that. In between the acts the presenters would give small speeches about how important God is and how the devil's agents were among us, waiting to harm us. One thing stuck with me because it was really grim. He told of how Satanists were kidnapping people and eating them. Police just across the border had found a hell house, and in that house was a witch's cauldron filled with human body parts coming from a young man who had been taken right off the streets. The boy had been kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, then made into a stew that the Satanists ate to give them magic powers, the presenter told us kids. This was the summer of 1988. Years later, curious, I looked up the incident. A student named Mark Kilroy had, in fact, been kidnapped, tortured, murdered, and put in a cauldron by a cult leader and his followers in order to give them immunity from the police and other cartels. All the details fit, except that this happened in March of 1989, the year after the youth revival. How did the presenters know about the murder? Were they talking about another murder? Or did I end up in a Christian-themed time slip? I asked my grandmother about it. She said she had no idea what I was talking about and denied ever taking me to a youth revival. All these years I've never been able to explain it. I used to be on a search and rescue patrol. We got a very strange call one night. A loud car crash in the middle of a rural area was reported by a nearby resident, but when emergency workers showed up, the victims were nowhere to be found. So we showed up to the scene, and at the end of a very long dirt road there was a 90-degree turn with an embankment. The car was clearly going at a very high speed, missed the 90-degree turn, hit the embankment, flew through the air, and the front of the car hit the ground so hard it gouged out a pretty sizable hole upon impact. The windshield showed 2 shattered impact zones where the passengers' heads hit, covered in blood and hair. There was more blood in and around the car. The scene was gruesome and didn't look like a survivable crash, especially given the mangled condition of the car. We expected to find bodies nearby. Police dogs, firefighters, and now an entire search and rescue party was not able to locate the victims after several hours. As night set in, it began to get more and more eerie. There was this horrible-looking car crash but no bodies to be found. Finally, after about 3 hours of searching, there was a 911 call that came in, a report of a bloody dead body found in the bed of a parked pickup truck in a rural home's driveway a couple miles away. Apparently a family was coming home from a vacation, and when they pulled into their driveway, they noticed the body and immediately called 911. So 2 police units dispatched from the search to respond to the call. We all assumed this would be the end of the story. Well, the police showed up to the house, and to everyone's surprise no body to be found. Somehow the body had vanished. There was blood, but no sign of anything else. So a second search radius started from that house. We searched practically the whole night. We're called back the next morning and nobody ever found the bodies. We eventually called the search off. To this day I have no idea what happened. When I was a kid, like 12 to 13, I was playing with my friends in their backyard. It was a perfect summer day outside, probably around 80 degrees and not a cloud in the sky. This detail is really important. So we're playing and I'm chasing my friend, but I suddenly stop because I notice something strange. I exhale and I realize that I can see my breath, just as you would on a really cold day. I call my friends over and they thought I was smoking or something because of how thick the vapor was. None of them can see their own breath until they are standing right next to me. It was only happening in that one specific spot. We walked around, but that was only in that one area that it was visible. All of us ended up just going home because we got pretty freaked out. Okay, so me, my 12-year-old brother and my dad visit Pakistan to see some relatives. This was my first ever trip to Pakistan, as I'm from the UK, and so everything came as a shock to me, but the most chilling thing I have experienced was during this trip. We all go to a family member's house and me and my younger brother decide to go upstairs alone and just explore the house, as we had been there for 3 hours and were bored. I think I need to explain that my brother is always joking, never serious for a single second, and this is the only time I have ever seen him show such dread and fear in my life. We go up the stairs and down the hallway where there is a completely pitch dark room which I am currently walking towards, and I look back and see him frozen on the stair steps just staring at the room in horror. Me being confused, I ask what's wrong and he says something coming from a joker like him, sent chills down my spine. This whole place isn't right, there is so much pain and suffering here, and then he ran back downstairs not saying a single word until we left that house. When I asked him, he just kept saying, "That house is messed up. I am not going back, there's something wrong with that family." 7 years later, I get the full truth after my dad reluctantly told me the story, and this makes everything 1000x worse. The house used to belong to a guy who raped his daughter who had severely disabled triplets, and when this happened, he murdered them all and threw himself in front of a moving train. There is no way my brother could have lied, faked or even knew about this story considering neither of us can speak the language, and he still says that his whole body told him to stay away from the upstairs and had terrifying thoughts just looking at the room. He's the type of person if he was lying to just admit he was lying 2 minutes later just so he can laugh in your face, so the fact that he was sensed about the history and his reaction is just unexplainable how he knew that. When I was 15 I lived in a 2-story house. My dog used to sleep with me. One night he was growling so loudly it woke me up. I had my back to my window and opened my eyes to a bright green light against my entire wall, obviously coming from the window. I wanted to turn and look, but I swear my body wouldn't let me turn around. I stood up back to the window, called my dog, picked him up and walked in the hallway. I closed the door and looked at the bottom of the door to see the light blasting from underneath it. I didn't tell my parents. I just slept in the hallway holding my dog that whole night. Once we were fishing off the west coast of BC, Canada. We stopped to jig for halibut. The depth sounder said something like 100 feet deep. It was an old school depth sounder, so you can't see a picture, just a red light at the 100 feet mark. So we let our jigs down and they stop at about 40 feet down. We had our rods out opposite sides of the boat, so our jigs would have been 20 feet apart at least. We both jigged a bit and trying to feel the bottom when our jig hit it. Usually you can tell if the bottom is sand or rock. This felt softer than a rock but harder than sand. After a few jigs we couldn't feel it anymore. So we let our jigs go down some more and they both went the other 60 feet down to the bottom. At that point, we noped out of there. What the hell was that under our boat? I was sitting on my back porch late one night when I noticed the motion sensor light in my driveway turned on. As I'm looking, a man turns the corner into my yard, stops and stares at me. I couldn't tell who it was, but I wasn't expecting anyone. I open the door and ask if I can help him, and he takes off running the other way. I lock the doors and go check my security cameras on the side of the house. There was no one on camera. One day my mother came and picked me up from kindergarten. We lived in a small town called Sentinel, Oklahoma. When we arrived home my mom opened the side door which went directly into the kitchen. Once we stepped inside we both froze. There in the kitchen counter was a butcher knife that had been buried into the counter a good inch. With a note under it. When my mom tore the note away and read it she turned pale and we noped out of the house real quick. This is what the note said. Please fix the window in your kid's room. I couldn't get it to open last night. The words were written in smeared red ink and had a frowny face at the end. The window above the sink had been open and that's how they got in. No one ever figured out who it was or why. Totally explains why I had moved into my dad's house in Oklahoma City just a few days later. Thank you so much for watching.